Welcome to Harbor Point TV. This is a brand new version of our online service specifically designed with you in mind, with our weekend message and then space to respond in thought, reflection, and prayer in worship. Whether you're watching at home with family or amongst friends, listening to the podcast on your commute or even a run, our hope is that you might find and take your next step towards Jesus, whatever that might be. And in this new portable format, we invite you to share it with others. So to get more information, get connected, or to make a contribution, visit our website at harborpoint.church. This is Harbor Point TV.
Hey everyone, I'm Jeff McGuire. This is HPTV, coming to you from Harbor Point Church in San Juan Capistrano, California. Great to be with you. A couple weeks ago, we were visiting my in-laws in San Antonio, Texas, and to do so, we flew from Orange County to Denver, and then connected a flight from Denver to San Antonio. And what I learned about as we descended into Denver is something that I later came to be known as mountain convection, which is an unusual amount of turbulence that happens in and around mountain ranges, say like the Rocky Mountains. And here's what that meant. That meant that there was going to be a little bit more than just your typical sort of where we're landing. There's a little bit of turbulence. It was a big time turbulence. And I know turbulence does not cause deaths. I mean, it's like in planes. I know that's the case. Mentally, I know that. I mean, I know that's not where the danger is. There's a lot of other danger. That's not it. And I'm watching as we're descending. I know there's a couple different forces at work on a plane, and I know my dad was a pilot, and I know there's like planes do a thing. They roll. That's where the wings dip side to side. That's rolling. There's pitching where the nose goes up and down. And then there's this other thing you may not know this is actually called. But picture the plane sort of skidding, like drifting, like skidding, kind of pointing right and left without going up or down or without tipping its wings. That's called yaw, Y-A-W. So the plane, as we're in it, is doing all those things. It's pitching and it's rolling and it's yawing back and forth, just floating sideways, which is the most bizarre feeling to have in an airplane. You get this one, but floating sideways is the weirdest, scariest thing in the world. And people are starting to go crazy. There's some tears. There's some stuff is falling down. People are getting a little bit scared. Drinks are falling over. I mean, and it's all this chaos starts happening. And of course the captain comes on, hey everybody, this is the captain. Just want to let you know, we're almost through the chop right now, and we should have you on the ground here in a couple minutes. It's 68 degrees on the ground, so real quick. And that's all he says. And we're like, show a little emotion. And we're like, we don't care about the weather. And my wife's looking through. She's like in front of me. I got my two sons in front of me, 2 seats ahead of me. Then it's Amanda and my daughter. And Amanda's grabbing onto my daughter's arm. Her fingers are turning purple. And my wife, Amanda, she looks through the seats, like through the seat cushions. She looks back at me and she goes, are we going to be all right? And I'm like, yeah, totally. I'm totally lying to her. I don't know. And she's like, I'm never flying again. And I'm like, I get it. I totally get it. And then I had this greater concern at that point. As this seems to be, this mountain convection is going on, I have another concern now that I'm worried about. Not for me, I'm good, but I just start thinking, what happens if this plane flight goes from scary to gross and people start having motion sickness? Because that's going to ruin, it's going to be a story I'll tell forever. It's going to be the worst thing ever. And by the way, at that point, the fear of my own life was keeping me from having any motion sickness. I wasn't sure about everybody else, but we were incident free and we landed. But I did start to think, I actually was curious, like as I was retelling the story, I'm like, I wonder what actually causes motion, like how can we get motion sickness? And some people do and some people don't. Well, here's what it is. Here's what causes motion sickness. This is from WebMD, where all of us go to and we have a headache and figure out, oh my gosh, it's probably cancer, it's a hangnail, oh my gosh, we have a heart attack, that kind of thing. But WebMD, here it is. It says, motion sickness happens when the brain receives conflicting messages about motion and the body's position in space. It continues. The conflicting messages are delivered from the inner ear, which is where we keep our balance, the eyes, the skin receptors, and the muscle and joint sensors. All of these things are sending different messages at the same time. In other words, motion sickness is essentially the result of an overabundance of conflicting messages or conflicting stories that our brain is getting. And the brain is fighting. It's actually fighting for a single message to kind of be able to figure out how to navigate. And when it doesn't get a single message or a unified message, that's when we get sick. Now, we live in a world of an overabundance of conflicting messages. And more than ever, we seem to be, as a people, at risk for a kind of motion sickness, if you take my meaning. Now, there is a solution, but that solution I'm going to talk about today for a lot of people and for a lot of really good reasons and for some not so good reasons, some bad reasons, that solution is not what people really want. It's not what they usually look for. And it's not something they tend to trust from time to time. And it's maybe because of a previous experience. It's something they reject outright before we even get going. And that's the thing I want to talk about today. Now, a few weeks ago, we started a series that's based on the idea that in survey after survey, people say over and over again, Americans say they have a pretty positive reaction to the person of Jesus. They like Jesus. But they also tend to have some pretty mixed emotions about all the other stuff that seems to be attached to him. In other words, people will often say when looking at Jesus, hey, look, I like Jesus, but there's a lot of things I'm not so sure about. I'm not so sure about all the other things that come with them. I mean, what a lot of people wind up saying is something along these lines. If I could just get to Jesus without all the other stuff, I might follow him too. But because there's so much stuff trailing behind Jesus, I mean, there is confusion and misunderstanding. There's conquest, and there's colonialism, and there's dogma, and there's the really confusing Bible, and there's partisan politics, which we talked about a little bit last week. And there's one other thing. It's probably the thing people cite more often than anything else about what they like about Jesus, but this one thing that's holding them back, which is the church. I like Jesus, but I'm not so sure about the church, his followers. That's the issue. In fact, the Apostle Paul will describe the church like this. Notice the words he uses. He says it this way. He's writing a letter to a pastor named Timothy. He says this: God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of the truth. Now, for a lot of us, we read language like that, and there's some more subtlety to it, but we read language like that and we go, gosh, well, it feels like for a lot of people that it's not a pretty shaky foundation. There may be a pillar and a foundation, but it's pretty shaky. Maybe because there's scandals, and there's greed, and there's abuse, and there's lies, and there's confusion, and that all, I get it. I mean, one of the sort of preeminent neo-atheists, as they were called recently, this guy, Christopher Hitchens, he died not too long ago, but he said this about all religion. Notice what he says, and maybe you felt that way before, or whatever. Here's what he says. We keep on being told that religion, whatever its imperfections, at least instills morality. Now notice he's pretty it's pretty broad sweeping. He's not just talking about Christianity, he's talking about all religion, but that at least we're being told that it instills morality, he says. On every side, there's conclusive evidence that the contrary is the case. Not a fan, I guess. And that faith causes people to be more mean, more selfish, and perhaps above all, more stupid. Whoa. Now, he's obviously, he's not a fan, obviously, like I said, but sometimes it's hard to argue with some of those things. I get that. And some of you have felt, or maybe you are feeling that too. And if you feel this is how you really feel, I just want you to know something which might surprise you, that the Bible actually, about that, it actually, in a sense, it actually agrees with you. I mean, the criticism and the correction of the Bible, in the Bible, of God's people is about greed and abuse and neglect. It's about self-righteous piety and hypocrisy all throughout the Bible. The Hebrew Bible, where the prophets are, a prophet is someone who just writes, they're God's voice for God's people. They speak God's words for God's people. The prophets are often talking about, they're criticizing the kings and the rulers for their abuse of power. They're criticizing the people for their indulgence and the neglecting of justice for the poor constantly. And then when you get to Jesus, he does almost exactly the same stuff, and he keeps critiquing the religious establishment for its hypocrisy, where it's often replacing the genuine love God called for with religious piety and their ability to keep distance from people. And so I get it. There's reasonable justification for asking the question, is it possible to have Jesus without the church, without all these religious people kind of messing it up? My father-in-law, I was just with one of our visits, we were talking, and I don't know whether he'd seen it on a coffee cup or he'd seen it on a t-shirt, but it was something that really spoke, and it's kind of got this Texas wisdom sort of vibe. He just said, look, and he's been burned by the church before, and he said, look, Jeff, here's kind of how I think about it. And I get it based on his experience. He said, look, I'd rather be fishing thinking about God than sitting in church thinking about fishing. And his whole friend group is like, that's us. That's what we're about that. We're all about, that's so true. And there may be some thoughts about God, but the church is kind of in the way. And for more and more people will say, listen, I like Jesus, but I want nothing to do with his church. Now, we can all agree, the world is a turbulent place, and it is sending us all kinds of conflicting messages all the time. And if God does intend to do something about it, and you may not believe that, but if God does intend to do something about it, what, if any, is the role of the church? And more importantly, sort of why do we need it? Now, when the word church is used, and you read it in your Bible, if you see the word church, more often than not, there's no real kind of parallel to the idea of what you and I know as church when the Bible was written. More accurately, the Bible is translating a different word called the word assembly. It's just the word, assembly that gets translated into the word church that we know. So the letters of the churches are written to these assemblies, these churches. It's written to these assemblies of people who are meeting in God's name. That's a church. But there's a couple other terms that the Bible will use. I'm going to focus on one today, but there's another word that the Bible will use, I think, that is a better picture of what God intends for his followers. And it's an incredibly powerful term. It's really simple. He just uses the word body. In Greek, it's the word soma. So as we talk about this, when you start thinking about what this is, it gives a much more dynamic picture than just an assembly or just even the word church as you and I know it. So notice as we talk, it'll come up in a second, about the word body. Here's what Paul will write in Ephesians chapter 4, beginning of verse 11. Here's what he says. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and the teachers. Now, Jesus is, apparently what is being written here is that Jesus is appointing a particular kind of leadership structure. Your early church leadership structure is apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. Then it says, these people have a particular role. Here it is, continuing on, verse 12. To equip his people for works of service. Now, when it talks about equipping people for works of service, this is actually the word ministry, translated literally. It's the word equipping people for works of ministry, to do stuff. Now, the job of leadership, apparently, the job that leadership does is not to do all the things. The job of the leadership is to get God's people, Jesus' people, prepared to do the work. And here's why, continuing on. When they do that, the body of Christ may be built up, and it keeps on going until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Now, all this is saying is this. When people take on this role, this idea about being part of this body of Christ, by the way, I should back up here real quick. The idea of being the body of Christ, by the way, isn't just a clever analogy like, well, let's just think of a way to talk about this. I just want you to consider, and we don't have time to go into it, but I just want you to consider the idea that the body of Christ isn't just an analogy, that when we start talking about that, one of the ways in which God will intend to dwell among his people in the world is through his body. His physical presence in the world is manifest or made known through the people who follow Jesus. Now, when people take that on, they wind up becoming mature. Like somehow or another, that whole idea of taking that stuff on makes us mature. And then it says this. Now notice, when people become mature, there's an outcome. Notice, starts with the word then. Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by the wind. Now, let me just really quickly say that. It seems like there's some kind of resistance to mountain convection here, if you know what I'm saying. Keep on reading. But, this passage is talking about a very specific kind of turbulence. Now, by the way, I should say this back before I even say that. Apparently, what happens is that all of us are longing for a way to not be tossed back and forth. And in fact, for a lot of us, the way the Bible will describe it, at least here, is that the measure of maturity, the way we kind of can measure how mature we are, at least one way, is our stability in turbulence. Being tossed back and forth, that's not maturity. Somehow managing to not be tossed back and forth, that's a measure of maturity. That's stability in turbulence, that's a measure of maturity. Are you with me? The measure of maturity is stability in turbulence. Now remember, we're talking about like motion sickness. Motion sickness is about the conflicting messages we get about the body and its relative position in space. So here's what Paul says. We're getting tossed back and forth. Mountain convection. I'm never flying again. Ginger ale is spilling. All that kind of stuff happening. It's going on. Everybody, we're going to be landing in a few. All that's going on. And here's exactly what's being talked about here. Listen, here's the particular kind of turbulence. Let's see, we blown back and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people and their deceitful scheming. Doesn't that sound like a bunch of conflicting messages? Do you ever get the sense that there are a lot of conflicting messages out there that are making us all feel a bit sick? The body, the church it's the answer for it, and it makes people stable in the midst of the deceit that they face. And the problem is this, and I get for a lot of us, we never were imagined that we're the ones being deceived. We always imagine, in fact, if we started thinking about the idea that we're getting these messages that, all we started thinking, especially during the political season, is like, gosh, we started thinking about all those other people who are so deceived and how hard it must be for them. And I'm not saying it's impossible, not at all, but doesn't it seem like it's far more likely that you and I, by ourselves, are far more likely to spiral into a dark place alone than together? I mean, for me, that's particularly dangerous for me. I don't know if you're an isolator like I am, but if anybody you know, maybe this is you, you're an isolator, you're a retreater, like, hey, things didn't go right, well then I'm just out of here. You bury stuff, you stew things, you just pack them inside and if you can pack them in deep enough, you'll never have to deal with them because that's way better, right? I mean, I cook up by myself. I cook up the most insane, wild narratives of anybody can imagine. I mean, I think of the things that are the craziest stuff when I'm by myself that I would never say out loud. And the reason I'd never say it out loud, because people who would be around me when I was out, they'd say, that's crazy. Here's what I know. And maybe this is true for you. Maybe you've experienced this. If you haven't, just want to invite you to consider this idea. What clearly makes sense to us in isolation when we're by ourselves, what clearly makes sense to us in isolation is clearly nonsense in community. Often what clearly makes sense to us in isolation is clearly nonsense in community. Meaning, we think things by ourselves when we don't have the ability to bounce it off other people, and it makes perfect sense to us, but when other people hear it, they go, that's not true. Or that doesn't make sense. That's nonsense. In fact, an indicator that you may not be making a good decision is a determination to cease anybody else's kind of counsel or wisdom. The Bible will call this sort of seeking our own counsel. When it's just you and Facebook, it's you and Instagram, or it's you and whatever news channel you're watching, or whatever websites you're reading, or YouTube videos you're kind of following on and could just keep on staying with. There's something that happens to us, and we start believing some nonsense things. We start saying things like, I've decided. Well, this is just something I've decided to do for myself. We're done talking about this. We're done thinking about this. I'm just going to go ahead and do this. Now, by the way, I'm not just saying this isn't just an excuse to not have any resolve, to not get anything done, to finally overanalyze. I'm just saying this is about a refusal to listen, a refusal to hear. And the best indicator, if you're listening to crazy stuff that you're hearing yourself say in isolation, is that you get tossed back and forth, blown by the wind. Mountain convection style. When we're alone and disconnected, it increases our susceptibility to turbulence. When we're alone and disconnected, it increases our susceptibility to turbulence. Is there any area of your life where you thought, listen, I'm just choosing to believe, or I'm actually believing that I'm on my own in this? Is it in finances? Is it in a relationship that you're seeking or you're presently in? Is it with your kids? Is it with your job? Is it your own physical well-being? Is there a pattern in your life that you continue to have there that you just go, well, I know I'm on my own. This is just how I get by. That if someone else heard you, they'd go, that's not really true. You're off there. That's not right. Look, I know the church is far from perfect. I mean, what family is perfect? Only the only family that's perfect is the one we follow on Instagram, right? And we all secretly hate them anyways. But the church is not perfect, but it is what we were designed to live within. I mean, look at a couple different times you get the idea of this relationship of people within the church for each other. Check this out. This is in Romans 12. In Christ, we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. In 1 Corinthians 12, as it is there are many parts, but one body. The eye can't say to the hand, I don't need you, and the head can't say to the feet, I don't need you. Meaning, there's a relationship that's intended for people to have in and with each other over and over again, and those people aren't perfect. I mean, I love what Tim Keller says. There's a pastor of a church in Manhattan called Redeemer Presbyterian Church, and he's no longer the pastor there, but here's what he says. Check this out. I realize that so many people's main problem with Christianity has far more to do with the church than with Jesus. It's a long quote, by the way, so stay with me. They don't want to be told that to become a Christian and live a Christian life, they need to find a church they can thrive in. They've had too many bad experiences with churches. I fully understand, he says. I will grant that on the whole, churchgoers may be weaker psychologically and morally than non-churchgoers. I'm like, hey, wait a second, Tim, what are you doing? But notice what he says. That should be no more surprising than the fact that people sitting in a doctor's office are on the whole sicker than those who are not there. Churches rightly draw a higher proportion of needy people. They also have a great number of people whose lives have been completely turned around and filled with the joy of Christ. You see, as we think about this, basically what he's saying is, there's a kind of confession we make when we're starting to come to church, and we don't even know it sometimes. What's this? It's just, I need this. Whatever this is the church has, I need it. And you may be a person who can't quite put your finger on the church and everything else, and I understand that. But there's something that God does in the church that's so incredibly important. And the only way really to navigate all of these conflicting messages that we keep getting from the world all the time that are in essence making us sick is to be committed to the church. Because the church is the expression. Granted, it's beautiful, but it's also an imperfect one. No question about it. But it is the expression of God's love into the world. And you need it, even if you don't think you do. But there's a big difference between merely going to church and being a consumer of a church and being committed to a church. And I just want to kind of highlight a couple of things. There's more to it than this, but I'll just give you a brief snapshot. Now, a consumer someone who's consuming church, this is someone who is passively involved in the church and disconnected, meaning this is a person who likes the idea of kind of being anonymous. There's really not much risk if there's some passivity and some anonymity. Look, I may or may not know some people I've seen before, but we don't really know each other in our lives, because why would we do that? That's not really what we're doing. That's not really our way of doing stuff. But we like it here. It feels wonderful. It's nice. People are kind, but there's generally a sense of disconnection. For the person who's committed to a church is passionate about it, and they're deeply connected. Some of the most important relationships in their lives, when they go through the things, when they're getting the messages from the world, when there's turbulence and maybe sometimes even a crash, they're the people that say, I can call on other people, and when I'm not there, I'm missed. And when I'm not there, I miss other people. And when I'm disconnected, those people know it, and there's a reaching out and an understanding, and my life needs these relationships, and I care deeply about it. It's not just something that sort of happens. There's some real care and some concern about what's happening in this community of people that's committed. That's what God's intending for the church. Next, a consumer talks about the church that they're connected to, however they're connected. Again, they're disconnected, but they're attending as a you or a they. So second person and third person pronouns. You know the church I go to, you know what they're doing? They're doing this thing. You know, I've been to this church, and they might even say, to speak to the church, they would say, you know what you guys should do? You should do this. And there's a lot of you and they in there. And sometimes there's some really great suggestions, but the point is, in a sense, the whole church has been reduced kind of to like the experience of a movie theater. Are you providing a great enough experience for me? Is the message keeping me awake? Is the music good enough? Those are the questions I'm asking about it, because that's really kind of how I'm thinking about it. They should do this thing, and they're constantly seeking in this mode. Constantly seeking a better version of whatever this is. See whatever those people can deliver for me. However, a person committed to the church says this. The church they use words describing the church as us and we. You know what we're doing. You know what we're about. You know what we're all about. They talk about it like there's a sort of familial kind of family relationship there. That there's an ownership for the good and the bad, because no church is perfect. But they're not about going to church. They're about belonging and feeling a sense of of connection and ownership as though it's their own family. And a consumer, let's say this. A consumer, in so many words, is longing for a particular thing. They're longing, basically, this is a big deal. More often than not, what a consumer is looking for is confirmation. A consumer is looking for confirmation of the things that they already believe. So there's this passive level of disconnected attendance about this thing that those people ought to give to me, but generally it's about confirmation. And what you find in a lot of cases is that people go, you didn't just confirm everything I already believed. And as soon as I didn't feel your confirmation of what I already know and believe, and I certainly don't want to change, well then I'm just going to go find somewhere else where I don't have to deal with those things, because I just want things to be confirmed or affirmed in some cases. But there's no life change in just confirming everything that already is. Now, a person who's committed to a church would say this way, or would live this way. They're not desiring merely confirmation, they're desiring transformation. And that's way riskier. Because transformation is about fear. It's about conquering the idea. In a lot of ways, it's about overcoming the fear that says, when I have to start being real honest about who I am and the kind of things I got going on, some of those things are going to need to change. And it's scary to say, here's what it is. And it's ugly, or there's a blind spot, or there's a thing I'm not really dealing with, and I don't really want to deal. And transformation is a courageous act, and it is intended to happen in community. And that's really what we want. At the end of the day, what we really do want is our lives to be transformed. And it cannot happen if there's a passive level of connection people longing to just sort of look at the church in a distance and to be confirmed in everything they already believe. By definition, there can't be transformation. But someone who says, look, I'm going to be in real relationships with people, that I'm going to join this family, and there's going to be, and I'm willing to take on the risk that broken people are in this with me, and that transformation isn't going to happen at a distance, and that there might be something that God intends to do through me that I could not do, or intends to do in me that I could not have done on my own. The writer of Hebrews says it this way, and I'll just end with this. The writer just says this: let us hold unswervingly to the hope that we profess, for he who promised us is faithful. Let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, meaning this is something that's done, obviously, together. And lastly, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another. Apparently, people early on in the church decided they didn't need the church either. And the truth is, that's not what was intended to happen for God's people. Let me just ask you, in the search that you have for life and for meaning and for purpose and everything else, are you connected? What is it that's drawing you in to be more a committed person, not simply to the idea or the experience of a church, but to the family that God intended you to have? You are not intended to be alone. God has given you his family, and his invitation is for you to take your next steps into it. So God bless you as you do so.
As we take a moment to reflect on God's love for us and respond to God's will for our lives, where is it that you might be isolating? What's keeping you from letting others in? Is it shame, fear of judgment, embarrassment, regret?
I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless stand before the throne. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all.
Thank you for joining us. If you would like to reach out to a pastor to talk about some possible next steps, get information about attending or viewing one of our live gatherings, or to make a contribution, be sure to visit our website at harborpoint.church. Also, don't forget to take a look at the discussion questions on our website to help you keep the conversation going.